Sleeping Beauty. A long time ago, there lived a king and a queen who said every day, "Ah, if only we had a child." But for a long time, they had no child to gladden them. So when a beautiful little daughter was born, the king could scarcely contain himself for joy. He ordered a splendid feast to celebrate the event, and he invited not only his friends but also the fairies who give gifts to newborn children. There were 13 such fairies in this kingdom, but the king was using gold plates to honor this special feast. And as he had only 12 golden plates, he asked only 12 of these fairies, leaving the 13th uninvited. Well, the feast was held with all splendor, and when it came to an end, the fairies bestowed their gifts on the baby. One gave her virtue, another good nature, a third wisdom, a fourth beauty, and so on, with everything that is good. But when 11 had said their say, suddenly the 13th presented herself at the door. She was an ugly old woman whose gifts to children were always evil. So the father of little Briar Rose had done well to find no place for her at the feast. But now she forced her way into the hall in a fury to think she had not been invited, and went straight up to the baby's cradle. "This is my gift to the king's daughter," she cried. "In her 15th year, she shall prick her finger with a spindle and die." With these spiteful words, she stormed out of the hall. The king was left in terror, the queen was in a panic, and the guests were struck dumb with fright. But just at that moment, the 12th fairy stepped forward, for she had not yet made her promise for the child. "Nay," she said gently, "the princess shall not die. She shall fall into a deep sleep." Now the king was so anxious to guard his dear child from misfortune that he thought the best would be to remove all spindles from his kingdom, and then she would never be able to prick her finger. So he gave orders the very next day that every spindle should be burned to ashes and never another one made. Meanwhile, the gifts of the fairies were plenteously fulfilled in the little girl, for she was so beautiful, modest, and kind that all who saw her loved her. But it happened on the very day when she was 15 years old that the king and queen, being now quite at rest about their daughter, since they thought they had put all danger out of her reach, went away from home, leaving Briar Rose all alone. No sooner were they gone than the princess began to feel a great desire to go poking about the palace into all the strange places she had never visited before. So she went into all sorts of great echoing halls and queer little chambers, and at last she came to an old stone tower with a narrow stair that went winding upward. Up the rickety steps she started. She climbed and she climbed. At last, she came to a door with a queer old, rusty key in the lock. When she turned the key, the door sprang open. There, in a dusty little room, sat a little old woman in gray, and she was working busily. "Good day, my good dame," said Briar Rose. "What are you doing?" "I'm spinning," said the woman, nodding her head. And she drew out a thread of flax, twisting it deftly between her fingers. "And what is that little thing you send twirling around there so very, very merrily?" "A spindle, a spindle." "Ah," cried little Briar Rose, "I've never seen anything merrier." And she crept up closer and closer. At last, as she watched the twisting and twirling, she grew so anxious to try herself that she said, "Good dame, pray, let me try to spin." At that, the old woman smiled, till the curves of her mouth went way up under her long hooked nose. Then she handed Briar Rose the distaff and the spindle. The princess tucked the distaff under her left arm, as she had seen the old woman do, and started to pull out a thread. But alas, she knew nothing of spindles, nor had she ever been taught how to handle one properly. So at the very first turn, she clumsily thrust the point into her hand and pricked her finger. In an instant, spindle and distaff dropped to the floor. Little Briar Rose sank up upon a bed and lay there in a deep sleep which spread over all the castle. Then the little old woman in gray disappeared, and the room in the tower was quiet and still. Down below, the king and queen, who had just returned to the great hall of the castle, went to sleep on their thrones, and all their courtiers with them. The horses went to sleep in their stables. The dogs went to sleep in the yard. The pigeons went to sleep on the roof. The flies went to sleep on the wall. Even the fire on the kitchen hearth stopped flaming and slept in its embers. The great iron kettle above left off boiling, and the cook, who was just going to box the ears of a careless scullery boy, let him go and sank down fast asleep. The wind fell, the flowers and grasses sank down on the earth and on the trees before the castle. Not a single leaf stirred again. Round about the place there began to grow a hedge of thorns. Snow fell with ice and sleet. So many years passed by, and every year the hedge grew denser and higher, till it hid every tower from sight. At last nothing at all could be seen of the castle, not even the flags on its roof. And over the spot, year in and year out, it was always frozen winter. But the story of the beautiful princess, sleep-bound in her castle, still went abroad through the land. From time to time, kings' sons came determined to wake her. But they were so frightened at the sight of that thorny hedge that they turned and fled. And the faster they ran, the longer were the arms the hedge of thorns reached out to seize and destroy them. One and all, they were destroyed while Briar Rose slept on. At last, after many, many years, there came to the land a certain king's son, to whom an old man told the tale of the princess. He told the king's son how sadly the other king's sons had fared, who tried to do battle with the hedge. But this youth said, "I'm not afraid of the hedge. I shall go and awaken the beautiful princess." The old man did all he could to dissuade the prince from going, but the youth would not listen to his words. Off he set toward the frozen castle. As he drew near, he felt its icy breath. He saw the snow over all and the giant thorn hedge that rose threateningly before him. But he was not afraid of that hedge, as the other king's sons had been. Confidently he strode toward it, and when he faced it squarely, with such utter lack of fear, it suddenly turned green, blossomed with beautiful flowers, and parted of its own accord to let him pass. Then the snow stopped falling and the ice melted. By the time he reached the castle yard, all signs of winter had fled. The earth was in bloom about him. But the horses and dogs were still asleep. The pigeons on the rooftops still had their heads buried under their wings. And when he entered the castle, the flies were still asleep on the wall. The fire slept in its embers, and the cook was still holding out her hand as though to cuff the scullery boy. Within the great hall, the king and the queen lay asleep on their thrones, with their whole court sleeping about them. All was so quiet everywhere that a breath could have been heard. At last, the king's son came to the stone tower with the narrow stair that went winding upward. Up the rickety steps he climbed and opened the door of the little chamber. There before him on the bed lay Briar Rose, asleep. Her cheeks were faintly flushed, her hair was like gold, and her clothes were all quaint and old-fashioned, like those his great-grandmother had worn. So beautiful was she that the king's son could not turn his eyes from her. As he looked, he stooped down and gently gave her a kiss. The moment she felt his kiss, Briar Rose opened her eyes and awoke. Then she looked at him sweetly and slowly and rose from her couch. Hand in hand, down the stairs together they went. When they entered the great hall of the castle, the king awoke and the queen and the whole court, and all looked at each other astonished. The horses in the courtyard stood up and shook themselves. The dogs jumped and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof awoke and flew away into open country. The flies on the wall crept again. The fire on the kitchen hearth flickered and flamed up. The great iron kettle began to boil, and the cook soundly boxed the ears of the scullery boy. The very next day, the marriage of the king's son with Briar Rose was celebrated with all rejoicing. And inside the castle and out was the life and bloom of the spring.